Okay, good evening. Can you all hear me? Yes. Welcome. I'm Gregory Wester. I'm the Executive Director of the National Academy of Design, and welcome to tonight's program. My part in this will be very brief and very easy, and my job is really just to welcome you here and we're so thrilled to kick off our winter-spring series of programs to accompany the exhibition Sites of Impermanence, which you will see later after tonight's program when we go down to the second floor, because this is not the National Academy of Design, if you haven't figured that out. This is an empty space we're using just for this evening. But the Sites of Impermanence, which you will see later, celebrates the work of our 8 most recently elected National Academicians, and I will look forward to seeing you at the bar for a glass of wine after the program. And with that, I'm going to turn the mic over to Ian Coffrey, our Director of Programs.
Wow. I'm so happy that you're all here for this special evening. So my name is Ian Coffrey. I am the Director of Programs here at the National Academy of Design. Tonight's program, Intention, the Function of Body and Space, is the result of a collaborative effort over many months between the National Academy and the design journal Untapped. We're very excited to host this conversation with Torkwase, Dyson, and Sara Oppenheimer, 2 incredible artists and recently inducted National Academicians whose work, along with the rest of the class of 2023, is on view downstairs in Sites of Impermanence. That's the second floor. And as well, to have the moderator tonight, the inimitable Tiffany Jow, Untapped's editor-in-chief. About the program this evening, each of our guests will present their work, and a moderated conversation will follow. We think the unique practices will open up several possibilities and questions, so we will have a Q&A at the end. Please raise your hand, and we'll bring a microphone to you. After the program is complete, we invite you to stay for a glass of wine and keep the conversation going downstairs on the second floor and to see the exhibition. You can reach that via the elevator or the stairs, which will be open after this. And before we get started, please silence your phones, and I would like to read our historical acknowledgement. The National Academy of Design was initiated by artists and architects to fill a void in the American artistic landscape of the 19th century, but we recognize our history has excluded many communities and cultures whose lineages and practices must be included in this country's art historical canon. Indigenous peoples, people of color, queer and non-binary individuals, and people with different abilities. We are committed to a process of dismantling the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism and white supremacy. We are excited to move forward and have conversations that reflect the important questions and issues of today. And now, the bios of our participants. Torkwase Dyson, National Academician, describes herself as a painter working across multiple mediums to explore the continuity between ecology, infrastructure, and architecture. With an emphasis on the ways Black and brown bodies perceive and negotiate space as information, Dyson looks to spatial liberation strategies from historical and contemporary perspectives, seeking to uncover new understandings of the potential for more livable geographies. Sara Oppenheimer, National Academician, is an architectural manipulator. Oppenheimer creates circulatory pathways that establish unexpected kinesthetic and visual relays between bodies and buildings. Rhythms and timescales of living systems flow from body to building and back again. The viewer is transformed into an agent of spatial change. Oppenheimer is a senior critic at the Yale University School of Art and a visiting critic at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. Tiffany Jow is a New York-based writer and editor. She is interested in how creative expression in any medium can promote new ways of thinking, seeing, and feeling. As the editor-in-chief of the design journal Untapped, Ms. Jow helps various creative practitioners implement their voices across platforms and articulate their mission, work, and process. And lastly, because this is a fuel from a partnership that has been ongoing for the last few months, I want to talk about Untapped, a design journal that looks back to look forward. Firm in the belief that both the near and distant past hold valuable insights for architects and designers, its stories identify the most important knowledge about improving the built environment and contextualize it for today and tomorrow. People have already solved or are making headway on many of the challenges the industry currently faces, but such achievements are often overlooked among an excess of data or in the pursuit of innovation or when they are presented in convoluted ways. Untapped stories unpack and add a fresh, critical perspective to those achievements, explaining why they're significant and how they can be useful right now. Untapped is not anti-innovation, rather it underscores the belief that the most efficient path to progress begins with building on what we know. Collectively, Untapped stories form an encyclopedia of ideas, a gateway to knowledge that serves as a timeless, ever-growing resource for all. And with that, I turn it over to Tiffany Jow.
Thank you. I'm really bad at clickers, so I'm gonna actually try to start this video now and make sure it works. But thanks so much, Ian, for that really sweet introduction. It is an honor to be here, to be part of the programming for Sites of Impermanence, and also to speak with Torkwase and Sara about the processes behind their work. Untapped shares the National Academy's belief in the power of art and architecture to transform societies and to enrich people's lives. The video that I wanted to play, there we go, is actually the first print edition of Untapped, which we released in October in Los Angeles at the Gallery Marta, and which did not exist when Ian and I first started talking. I think maybe we had a proof or something at some point. All the Academy had to go on was our weekly digital stories, which we started publishing in February 2023, and the partnerships that we've done to date, which include events with folks like Vitra and the Cooper Hewitt and Rockwell Group and the Brooklyn Bookstore Head High and the School of Visual Arts and many other organizations. What I think resonated with the Academy and with many of our other readers is Untapped's focus on ideas. We, as Ian said, our stories identify the most important knowledge for improving the built environment, and we contextualize that for our readers to use right now and also for the future. And we really believe that the most efficient path to progress begins with building on what we already know. So our writing involves a lot of critique and a lot of research and a lot of history, but we are very careful not to use language that's too academic or elitist. We're very dedicated to explaining these ideas and to showing our readers why it matters in language that is approachable and authoritative, that is compelling and that is real, and sometimes even funny. We have a lot planned for 2024, including our next print edition, which we'll release in the fall. But none of it would be possible without several key individuals, and these include Scott Hudson, who is here somewhere. He's the CEO and the creative director of Henry Built, which is the design company that publishes Untapped. And Scott flew all the way here from Seattle for 48 hours, and I'm so glad that he's here to be a part of this evening. Yes, give him a round of applause. Also, Yıldız Kajeli, our visionary graphic designer, and Mimi, our faithful copy editor, and Cleo, our very diligent and essential fact checker, and Wade, my remarkably supportive and encouraging husband, and everyone who is listening and watching and who have read and supported our work so far. The stories that we create are made to be a resource for you. So I'm so proud of what we've created together so far in 1 year, and super excited for everything that lay ahead. So about tonight, we are here with two brilliant individuals who are seasoned researchers in the different relationships between the body and space. So we're going to talk about how their interventions facilitate new ways of seeing space, as well as the human ability to shape space, both as an individual and as a collective, among other things. So as Ian said, we'll start with each artist giving a brief presentation, then we'll talk, and then we'll open it up for questions, and then we'll go downstairs for a reception. So I hope that sounds good. So please join me in welcoming again Sara and Torkwase.
Thank you, Tiffany. Thank you to the extraordinary team at the National Academy. Thank you for coming this evening, and Torkwase, I'm really honored to be here with you this evening. It's a pleasure to talk to you. I want to start with this picture. And I think it's interesting to look at it and understand that we are looking at a floor that is many years ago now, but somehow still similar, located in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And it's not only far away, geographically or spatially, but this picture is also far away temporally. We are looking backwards, and we are looking down, and we are looking elsewhere. We experience it as here, now, in front of us. And the experience of interconnection, this experience of connection to this distant location, is an act of radical imagination. Our minds frequently bridge spaces, times, bodies, sensoria, extending our collective selves across incalculable distance and scale. My work explores our cognitive capacity to absorb linkage and interconnection. How do the rhythms of our environment shape our sense of distance and adjacency? How might our sense of interconnection be heightened or disrupted through the manipulation of built space? This exhibition space was divided into 6 rooms. Visitors entered the space from a central quadrant and traveled through the corners of the 6 zones. Each of the rooms was illuminated with fluorescent white light. And as the visitor crossed each threshold, their eye compensated towards color neutrality. The perceived difference in light temperature became a tool for marking spatial change. Thresholds mediate procession. Windows reflect daylight, and vents direct airflow. The building's material boundaries create an ever-changing relay of immaterial trajectories. Daylight penetrates material surfaces, expanding and contracting construction joinery, and living bodies generate live loads that shift structural slab and non-structural partition walls. Buildings are time-based. In 33D, daylight saturated the exhibition space. Visitors entered the exhibition through a transparent threshold. Once inside, the exterior was mirrored across interior surfaces. Our ability to shape and shift our environment amplifies our awareness of the rhythms that connect us to our environment. S337473 was my first tactile piece. Watching people touch and turn these elements, I noticed that people began to communicate with one another through gestural contact. Someone would touch a pivoting glass volume, transforming it into a lintel or a beam. Others would mirror their actions and touch them too. Everyone was in the system, and there was communication across it. Touch transformed the artwork into a connective tissue. Systems evolve. Inputs and outputs overlap. In Sensitive Machine 2021, I created a network of interconnected instruments. As visitors manually turned a black beam, a choreography of spatial change was set in motion. Lighting tracks slipped between the vertical surfaces of sliding walls, and luminosity levels fluctuated while sightlines were interrupted and revealed. We may notice an adjacent wall is moving because it alters our immediate surroundings, blocking or clearing our path. But we may be unaware that we are shifting the position of a lighting track overhead. Learning the intertwined energetic pathways becomes a part of the viewer's work. S281913 was comprised of a pair of glass and metal structures that were also manipulated by visitors. The lighting grid, fixed overhead, is reoriented through gestural contact. Manipulation modulates the cycles of illumination. Linear fluorescence interrupts the radiant daylight of Biscayne Bay. Across a distance, new possibilities emerge along different axial relationships. The energy of human motion intertwines with the frequencies of the environment. Sliding a black bar modulates the position of overhead lights. As sunlight diminishes and daylight becomes nighttime, a reflective facade is transformed into a transparent window. Light diffuses across the building membrane, and the radiance of the oscillating instruments spills onto the street.
Thank you, Sara. Thank you, Academy. I want to echo Sara's sentiment around gratitude, and I'm so happy to be here, and thank you so much for the invitation. And the Academy, thank you so much for your opportunity to engage, share, and create these sort of new encounters. I've known Sara for a few years, and this is the first opportunity we've had to sort of be this close in proximity. So this is a special moment for me. Thank you. In this ask to have a conversation with Sara and share my work, I was, as all of us do, go through our slides, go through our works, and go through our sort of archive. And I came across these drawings that I had done maybe 2 years ago. And for some reason, between then and now, I wanted to share these in the public as meditations. I didn't know it at the time, of course, I was making them, because drawing is so embedded in my practice and everything starts from there. So thinking about this work in relationship to the piece that you all will see after this talk downstairs, they all belong to a series entitled Bird and Lava. So Bird and Lava was a series that came out of this moment of COVID, where I was thinking about, of course, geology, geography, as I do all the time, but also thinking about movement and migration, and all of the different ways in which time and space in my own wandering mind grapple with the idea of lava and the idea of flight. So this moment of, I would say, leapfrogging or creating discursive conditions in the middle of a confinement that was an area of COVID was really productive. So I wanted to start off by thinking about practice, my practice as a drawing, through meditation, and when I'm thinking about shape and space as form. So I sort of start there and ask myself, if shape, space is a medium, if space is a medium, can the geographies and the geometries that I refer to in my work, can it hold literature? Can it hold language? Can it hold poetry? So Bird and Lava was a sort of entry point into a set of drawings that for me spoke about the spiritual practice in my work, the imagined space in my work that sort of collides with ideas of movement and thresholds in space and time and distance. So through the sort of umbrella of my practice over the last 5 years, these two drawings have now situated themselves into my practice as meditations. And so initially they were titled Closer, Close, Closer. And that rings a bell with me in this moment. And in my practice, I realize as I think about ideas of touch and making and construction and leaning into space as form, after these pieces of both transparency, line weight, sort of this visual vocabulary that I had developed through drawing, how can I take this in the realm of I call these constructions. So how do I then take paper and make volumes, and volumes slip into throughways, and throughways slip into planes? So thinking about these geometries now in questioning my practice, not only can these geometries hold literature, but can I create a condition of self-generating forms that exist in a place of autonomy, where I get to a place where these geometries have themselves a sort of internal condition of the work. And I found that collage, or thinking about collage in terms of construction, helped me get to that place. So layers become really apparent. Surface texture becomes really apparent. Working the surface in terms of transforming what is used here, graphite, ink, paint, and acrylic, transforming the surface even after the work is done. So the work has both memory as a sort of medicine inside of making, and it also has these geometries that I'm able to sort of, through this construction, turn into actual space in the work. So as I think about these geometries that are often in my practice, dancing around paper and plane and paintings, trying to bring Bird and Lava and that sentiment around what does it mean to deal with two things that are absolutely irreconcilable, and things that have don't promise the condition of stability, and leaning into that. So I've gotten to a point in my practice where my work has no promise of stability. It has no promise of something that's certain or determinable. And what does it mean to create conditions in the studio where then that begins to become self-generative? So moving through this paperwork into collage work, into working on wood panels. So I started with these sort of diametric conditions and wanted to move into something that was, or leaned into haptic surfaces that gave you a foreground, a middle ground, and a background, where your sort of cognitive condition can move through the space. And so I found myself in my practice and thinking about practice, really understanding the history of these geographies, which definitely have to do with histories of Black self-liberation conditions, right? How one enslaved person or how one person as a fugitive uses architecture as a medium for freedom, infrastructure as a medium for freedom. And how do I bring that sort of cunning ability to manipulate space, understand space, and imagine space in the condition of indeterminacy? How do I think about that through image making? So with these sort of panels that I started to collage together, I find myself constructing a space as well, and really landing on the space, well, is this a drawing, is this a painting? And thinking about that sort of liminal space between painting and drawing, I sort of gave up and leaned into that liminal space and started creating actual thresholds, right? So in this work, and I'll move forward, in this work, you have these moments where, you know, as the work offers itself downstairs, where graphite becomes this material that I can really take through a transformative process, where I can create a ledge, I can create a condition of the cantilever, I can create a condition where you have this haptic moment next, or a sort of moment of expression next to something that's absolutely about a hard edge geometry. So I was able to create work in the studio where I could talk about built environments of my memory. I could talk about histories of geography and ground and earth. And I could talk about being an artist whose, you know, form is both architecture and infrastructure, whose form is both space and language, and really dance around the studio in a way that I had not before, and letting my own body into the surface of the work. And thinking about also graphite as a material that I can lay on a surface, and it's a sort of matte surface, and next to it, this shift where the surface becomes a sort of reflective surface. And this matte, this thing that absorbs light in relationship to something that reflects light, allows me into a kind of memory of growing up in Chicago and transversing the city as a, you know, sort of youth in this sort of condition of freedom that sort of lands in this work for me. So thinking about these kinds of built forms and them taking me to a condition of memory in Chicago, I really felt memory as medicine. And I really felt, and this goes through our conversation that's happening on your cues to us, thinking about the buildings and the built space, the viaducts, right, the edge of the water in relationship to the city, and being in a space where you don't feel over-policed and you don't feel like you're in danger. You feel like you can traverse a city because of its architectural layout and have some sense of freedom, right? And take away from that as an adult person who's making art, thinking about and working through in your practice to those moments of freedom, right? Not representing them and not pointing to them, but knowing that they exist as a power of creation and creativity to land a work that hopefully communicates ideas of possibility in relationship to indeterminacy. So I'll just go through the last bit of the slides. So part of my practice in the cutting and the drawing and the collaging and the constructing, oftentimes when I'm thinking about these very quotidian moments about my history and its relationship to the built environment from Chicago to Mississippi to North Carolina to Virginia to New York, and transversing these geographies where cities and built environments are completely, not only do they change, but they change me, right? And they change what I desire, they change what I see for myself, and they also change my hand, right? So I am interested in architecture now in a way where I touch a building. You know, when I was 19, when I was 25, when I was 35 or 40, I wouldn't necessarily touch a building. Now I can't pass a building without touching it. The same way I used to touch trees, right? And now I understand in this moment of my practice, like touching and moving and thinking through space is how I come up with these various surfaces, right? So how can I think about a throughway in relationship to the history of Tuareg architecture, nomadic architecture in sort of northern Kenya in relationship to the house that my grandmother, where she opened the door and let me in and gave me fruit. These kinds of things all embedded in my own body sort of land in this work in the form of improvisation, right? So how do I, now that I'm in a moment where the shapes sort of self-generate these conditions, and then they create these throughways and open up conditions of texture that sort of are trans-historical. So in this moment of progress and process in my work, I think about how all of these conditions become distilled, right? And all of this memory opens up to, in my practice, moving past locating the condition of the meditative, locating the condition of memory as medicine, locating the condition of a haptic texture, building surface into something that is in the round, right? Where I can have a moment where I have a solid, and depending on the condition of the viewer, that solid immediately becomes a throughway, right? And thinking about this sort of amalgamation in my practice, or this sort of arc in my practice that takes me from something that is about a deep interiority and the pleasure of drawing into something that gets me to a place where quietness, is the condition and is the subject. And distillation is the subject, but with a breadth or depth where you feel the solidness in your own body and memory, and you feel the throughway, not only through the object, but you also experience space as a form, right? So this sort of negative and positive space, the way in which Chicago is laid out as a city, the way in which the earth and geographies of Mississippi is laid out in the history, all of these have to sort of end up in my practice in some way. So I think that that's my meditation for the moment in my practice. And I thought about that this morning.
Thank you so much. I think it's always so special to learn about the work directly from the artist, and also in doing so, learning about both of your respective personalities and how you think and speak about the things that you're doing. I think it's a really great path to the things that we're going to talk about now. I wanted to begin our conversation by talking about great art, which to me includes architecture, includes sculpture, and really any form of creative expression that changes your perception or offers you a different view of something. Since we're talking about space and bodies within space, and how space can impact the people within them, I wondered if both of you could tell me about a space or a building that changed you and that perhaps set you on the path that you're moving on today.
I think it was someone else's space. Is that okay? That I never actually saw. So, Henry Box Brown. So learning about Henry Box Brown, who created what I would call an architectural space, and shipped himself from Virginia to Canada in a postal service that really didn't exist. So thinking about Box Brown and this enclosure that he created, and understanding that it was an architectural moment, and what the box sort of evolved into is something that Box Brown would then turn into a performance space. So he created the box as a materialed body to ship himself outside of the institution of slavery, and then transform that box into a sort of performance prop where he would open this box and there would be images and conditions of his escape. So when I think about that in relationship to my own architectural memory, and locate that as an architectural condition in relationship to fugitivity and nomadicity. And then I think about the pavilion, right? And could that box in its later state, could we call it a pavilion? So that's the sort of, object, turn architecture, turn pavilion, turn folly, right? So in the end, that box not only turned into a sort of an architectural moment, but it also turned into an object that represented architecture at the same time, that then turned into a performance, right? And turned into sort of this magic way he told these stories. So that's the sort of architectural moment that opened up possibilities for me.
Yeah. That's really fascinating.
So I thought a bit about this question, and I was thinking about spaces that I've inhabited that have left a deep imprint. And I think in some ways, one of the most significant locations was shortly after finishing studies. I got a job, and I was hired to give the same lecture in a lecture hall 4 times every week for, actually it ended up being many years. And it was an interesting experience because at first I entered the lecture hall, and this was a kind of concrete structure, cinder block structure, and I imagined it was empty. And there were empty seats, and there was an empty stage, and it was set up. And, I'd go back, and people would fill the lecture hall, and they'd empty the lecture hall, and they'd fill the lecture hall, and they'd empty the lecture hall. And I started to recognize that the space was incredibly full. That it was impossible for the space to ever be empty. That in fact, the space had within it so much that we could barely move. That we were somehow so tightly structured in our relations to one another, in our relations to language, in our relations to social hierarchy, in our relations to meaning and formality, that our blindness to the fullness of the space was part of the space. And I think that has shaped what I've done ever since, actually.
Yeah, I love that because both answers sort of speak to the possibility of space. It can be, there's more maybe than meets the eye, which is something that I think both of your work also speaks to, which is this idea of facilitating or inviting new ways of seeing space. If I understand your respective approaches correctly, Torkwase, yours I feel is very much about learning everything you can about a specific subject and then trying to push something through that is new, that you invent, that is not recognizable. And I thought it was interesting I think in Theaster Gates's nomination letter for Torkwase for the Academy, he actually wrote about how he admired her dedication for refusing to give people a, quote, representational moment around the concepts that she is exploring. And then Sara, I feel, is really looking to make visible things that might not be obvious when you're in a space, sort of like how you were just talking about now. And for me, the result of those approaches is a very not easy answer when you look at the work. I think you don't really know what you're looking at right away. And so the viewer sort of has to engage with the work, to deal with the work in a way, and figure out what it's saying for them. So I wondered if both of you could talk about how you create conditions that speak to people in this way, that sort of not force them, but like invite them to grapple with what's in front of them.
So I think that's a very interesting question, and I think that there's sort of stages and steps to how that evolves for me for every work. I think I'm very interested in absorbing what is the same about the conditions of a situation, and what we sort of assume is not there, but is we take for granted. So what are the the rules that underpin the location that are, let's call them generic rules. And I then, in some ways, imagine that there's two operations that are performed. One is an operation of kind of camouflage, whereby the space can be ever so slightly shifted or altered, but it is not, it somehow disappears into the context, and then that camouflage works to isolate other conditions which then become evident. And that doubling of the kind of camouflaging and the bracket, let's call it a bracketing, I think they do that work for me.
Yeah.
Can you ask the question again, please?
Yep. So how do you create spaces that force people to deal with your work, or that invite them to deal with what's in front of them?
Yeah, I have no idea. And what I mean by that is that that's not intentional. I'm not trying to do that. Like I don't necessarily think about audience. I don't necessarily think about programming, or I don't think about, I think when the apparatuses are in place to put my work or put my ideas in public, I think the curators are able to do that work, right? So with me, I just am trying to make forms that help me understand what happened, right? And what's happening, and the potential to unkeep a kind of history that is about collage and abstraction and obstruction. So in trying to answer questions around ideas of either improvisation, migration, dispossession, autonomy, geography, language of living, humanity, I'm making this work to understand world building. So I think that you, as an artist, it's necessary that I practice in those shapes that we need for that. And then by default, there's a sort of welcoming or composition that's welcoming. And then there's another apparatus to sort of, okay, Torkwase, let's operationalize this, right? But that's outside of what I think about. So when I make a sculpture or I make it's not that I'm making an invitation. I'm presenting a thought, and then there needs to be someone else that makes that invitation to people. Right. But I ask that question often, and I struggle with it because I'm not that generous of an artist. No, it's not. You know, if I tried to, maybe it would be terrible.
If you were
but I
making
think
it not
that,
for you.
I just hope that when I'm thinking internally out loud, someone else, at least one other person, has those doubts or questions or conditions.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that's really interesting. I didn't expect that answer at all. But I think that maybe whether intentionally or not, both of your work in some ways highlights our ability to shape space, whether it's you actually, doing this thing for you, or, maybe in a more intentional way speaking to that. And like Torkwase, I've been thinking a lot about just the way that your work looks at the infrastructure or like the built environments that determine the ways in which particularly Black bodies move through space, and also the ways in which it engages with how Black and brown bodies understand and envision and also negotiate different spaces. And then Sara, I don't know why I keep coming back to this work, but it's C010106 at in Austin, right? It's essentially two mirrored panels that are in parallel, and then they cut through a bridge that is outside. And so by looking at it, you know, you can, it sort of, you start to understand how you're co-authoring this landscape. And there was one interview that Sara did that I thought was really helpful for me in understanding its work. Sara said, I understand the space is responding to me, and you understand that the space is responding to me. So we can shape this space together somehow through our coordinated actions over time. And so it seems to me that both of you are sort of, whether consciously or not, helping people to recognize their own ability or the collective ability of folks to create spaces that somehow serve people better. And I wondered if you could just talk about why that ability we have is important to underscore.
Can I talk about that piece, your piece first?
Yeah.
I think you have an email blast. Yeah, you have an email blast. And this piece in Austin, and I open, when you send out the emails, I open them and I tend to look at the work. And you had this piece in Austin. I think it's the only time felt so urgent to respond to this piece. And in my mind, seeing that moment of throughway in those panels, I can't remember exactly but my instinct was that I was being directed, that there was a clearing on the other side. And this idea of the clearing or the other side of that other space is all possibility. And Toni Morrison has this moment in Sula where Sula is making love to somebody, and she says, she's talking about Sula, and Sula is like in this free fall. And I think that your work, when you create these thresholds, when I feel like there's a free fall, the velocity really cognitively pushes me through, right? So it's between imagination, it's between sort of the physics of a quanta condition, but I think operates across your work, but that particular work invited me into a free fall. And I only saw it online, so I can't imagine what it would do to my senses if I saw it in person. But it was really a great moment.
Thank you.
So I just want to say that
Yeah,
that
it's
piece.
I think because it's isolated, that's why it's so impactful, and it seems it's just on a building, it's just there. For, I think those are similar reasons why it spoke to me too. I too have only seen it online.
Yeah.
But maybe.
So before I want to ditto that.
Well, I will say something about its isolation. And then I actually am really struck, Torkwase, by what you are discussing about context. And I have a question for you about it in relation to this issue of isolation. I think that one challenge that I find is in making work is about how to establish its boundary from its surrounding, especially when the work is buried in the surrounding. So in fact, what we perceive as the boundary doesn't generally match with the actual boundary. So this idea of perceiving something in isolation and what the power is to perceive something in isolation is a real question. And it raises questions for me around ideas of autonomy. And is something autonomous or is something dependent? And what is the relation of being contextually entwined and autonomous? And I suppose that's a question I have of you, Torkwase. Like, what is the relation of being contextually entwined and autonomous at the same time?
Well, I think that this is a question of property in the state and the history of the colonial condition. We're all in the bound, right? There's no such thing as being out of the network of the bound and the colonial settler genocidal condition, right? So we're all in this built environment that has to do with a clearing. So I think this idea of registers of autonomy it's a slippery space when it comes to conditions of property. And because we're bound in this system of property and belonging, I think that that autonomy is also a slippery slope. Within the art object, and I'll recognize that it's difficult for an art object to achieve a condition of autonomy in that boundness. But as we are dealing with human behavior, the haptic, the embodied experience, I believe that we strive for a moment of autonomy in relationship to agency, in relationship to liberation, because we can train our minds and ideas and minds and instincts to know that this is mostly a fiction, right? And to split, like these buildings, right? They propagate, often buildings propagate a condition of authority, which is a complete condition in relationship to who is human, who can be read as human, and who can be treated as human with the full ownership of one's own senses. So I think that this is a really critical question, and this is an unfixed answer because it's an unfixed reality. That autonomy in that network of the condition is slippery. And I think that liberation comes from the deeply quotidian moments. And quotidian on a level that is, about the indeterminable. So I think if we can present works that offer a real subjective transformation by the viewer to get into an interior space that is so quotidian that anything you do resists the condition of property, right? So that's where I move through my practice, understanding that that is a place to be. And within this question of perspective and buildings and perspective, in my mind, that is, in relationship to autonomy, what's really important, I think, in the history of Black livable bodies is this idea of ocular brutality. And I think, Mario, we talked about this idea of ocular brutality, where your perception is built by the thing that dispossesses. So you have to, if you're trying to be online, and when someone else is controlling every perspective that you experience as a bodily perspective, whether it's the hull of a ship or any kind of condition that is you're without your own ability to move your own body, or your body is forced, all of that is just some condition about light and exposure to light in conditions of enclosures. So when you create these throughways, or these moments that break up an enclosure into a throughway, that's a potential for an autonomous, sort of hyper quotidian experience for me. So when you make a threshold, my only obligation to you or the work is to be acutely aware that on the other side of that, there's a potential for a real quotidian autonomous condition in this hyper capital network of being. know that was, but does that make sense?
Yeah. Yes, yes. I had a question about boundaries too. I don't know if I'll say it as eloquently as you just did. But when I was thinking about your work from my sort of objective perspective, it seemed to me that there was some kind of, maybe not a boundary, but like a framework to both of yours, whether it was a conceptual framework or a historical framework or, you know, a symbolic framework. And I like frameworks. I like structure because there's so many, they seem so limiting in some ways, like with all their boundaries and rules. But then also they can be sites where innovation happens. Like I know, Sara, you're interested in tools like the metronome. And so this is a very precise and very rigid way of keeping time. But then all these other ways of counting time has emerged from it, from this framework. And so in that way, this thing is actually a gateway to something else or, you know, to another way. And so I don't know, I wondered if you had any reaction to that and thinking about frameworks, maybe not necessarily your work, but as like a gateway to possibility.
I have a thought in relation to this discussion you're having about the threshold and this question about boundaries. And it's really interesting to me that you're talking about passing through. Because in some ways I would say I am not so interested in passing through. I'm interested in making the boundary thick so that the boundary suddenly is palpable and is the space of the work. That inside that boundary, that's where the work is. And the through is only, it's like the illusion. And I'm thinking in some sense of this idea of the metronome, that it's the interval. It's as much the boundary of the interval and that kind of instant that you stretch the interval, that it becomes elastic as the spatial delineation becomes thick. I think those things are the space of work for me, and there is no through. There is just the space of those relations. So.
Do you want to respond to, or
No,
I feel like I did my part?
Yeah, no. Well, I think that, you know, that's the thing about once you put it out in the world,
Yeah.
people do with it what they will, you know.
I want to shift gears a little bit because I know both of you wanted to talk about process. I think even just listening to the presentations at the beginning, in some ways, I think Sara and Torkwase's work is, their process couldn't be more different. Sara seems very, you know, calculated in some ways, where Torkwase seems very fluid. So I just wanted to give both of you an opportunity to talk about your process and also how it's changed over the time that you've been working.
I work for fluidity, right? I need structure. So my practice, as I was talking about earlier, to really focus what I was sharing on in my practice now, is that it took me years to come up with an equation that was a structured equation that was to a great extent measurable and numerical, that I could then create a foundation and a theory from. So what you're looking at is an equation that moves into abstraction because of the physical work of drawing, painting, and making sculpture. So it comes from a rigid, disciplined technique that is absolutely operational in my studio. Everything in my studio is set up to create conditions of equations so that when I'm in the work and the time happens in the work, that those equations fall away and I'm producing something that is a complete unfamiliar condition, right? So when you spoke earlier about audience, and my job in my studio is to produce the unfamiliar off of a thing I know that is true and also real. So what the public experience is work, you know? It's just work. But when it begins, it's, when I mean work, I don't mean that I don't need to qualify it. But you experience those things with me, like that sort of in that space, in that work, in the creative process. You've experienced the end of that. But it has to be generated by an ontological condition that is both fixed and unfixed. So that fluidity it's tricky, you know. So I don't want to pretend that this is all about expression or vibe or mood or emotion. It's really often about power and force and clarity and transformation. Thinking about my work in the canon, it's very clear that my work is for that purpose as well. Like who am I in conversation with, and how do we take these methods of art making to another invention or developmental invention that can add to the conversation. So I don't want to present the work as some innocent free flow of emotion and river. Underneath its power is a Black radical tradition of technique, discipline, and skill.
I think this idea of process is really fascinating because it taps into so many different ways and histories of making and types of what we call work. So there's and ways that labor is seen as sort of recognizable or valuable, and ways that it is understood as an art practice. And I think that I've thought a lot about how the working mimics and mirrors different practices, and how my working mimics and mirrors practices, but is always sort of moving across them. So one of the things that's very somehow central to how I work is a kind of media transposition. So it's always seeing the work materialize in many, many different forms, and knowing that no form is the final piece, which is kind of this complicated remove. And Tiffany, you asked how things have changed. I think what's become more and more important to me is drawing. And I don't mean drawing necessarily with a pen or with a computer or I don't mean drawing in that way. I mean drawing in the sense that you make a mark, and that mark changes how you behave. So then you make another mark that changes that first mark. So there's a kind of immediacy, like a tactile embodied immediacy to that process. And that to me has become essential. And one of the real beauties of allowing, of building and creating works that are, that move and that are tactile, is that there's no way to understand how they behave without having an actual one-to-one experience with them, and there's no way to, let's call them, tune them like an instrument without understanding how they stop, how they start, how does friction work, how do we experience something that happens behind us. And so everything, one of the things that's become sort of essential, or my sort of drawing, primary aspect of drawing is a real iterative prototyping where all of the parts are always at hand. And there's a sense, okay, if there's an air, if there's a dampening, is it a pneumatic dampening, and how does that pneumatic dampening create tension in the sensation of something? And all of that is very immediate, and it's very responsive, and I think that responsiveness is ever more important to me.
I think that's a good segue into my last question, because I want to make sure that we have time for others to ask questions too. So to finish, I actually wanted to talk about physics. I went to a talk a few weeks ago at the Rubin Museum where Laurie Anderson interviewed the poet Jane Hirschfield, and they were talking about time. And Jane, if you don't know her, was an incredible speaker, like so amazing just in how she spoke. And she was talking about how she had asked one time a bunch of physicists how they defined time. And she said that they all had the same answer, which was that time is a space in which change happens. And I thought that was such a beautiful response to the question. But also a really nice definition of space, that this is a place where change happens. And I was getting ready for this conversation, so I obviously thought of both of you. But I don't know, I wonder how, through your work, the spaces and the objects that you've created, you have changed. How you've changed. How these spaces have changed you.
I will respond to that. I feel that I've become increasingly interested and sensitized to the way the spaces perform and the way they interact with visitors to those spaces or inhabitants of those spaces. And I think that's been increasingly my greatest teacher.
I think I'm working towards a change. I think I'm climbing a mountain, trying to get to a cliff, and looking for a really sturdy cliff to just jump off of. And so I know that can happen, because it's happened to me with other people's work. Like, I've seen a piece of work and it completely actually changed me, right? What is happening? Like a John Biggers painting, like a mural of John, like, boom, different Torkwase. So I think that's a destination.
Yeah.
I am working very hard to get to my cliff and look forward to a whole different Torkwase. You know, I know that there's something there.
I think that's a great way to open it up. If you have a question, can you raise your hand and we'll bring you a microphone? I think we have time for a few. Someone definitely has one. Yes, two over here.
Hello. Oh, yeah, that's working. I have a question for Torkwase about a comment you made. You talked about memory as medicine. And I'm wondering if you could just speak a little bit more about that and what that means for you.
Sure. So, a fantastic painter and sculptor, his name is Radcliffe Bailey, who transitioned recently, has a book titled Memory as Medicine. And what I learned from that, or what I am thinking about, is trying to tap into my own sort of bodily memory, molecular memory. If in relationship to physics, energy is always in a condition of state change, what is the memory of my body and my being? So in my practice, I set up a condition with my drawing. Say I'll choose a song, and that song is 120 seconds. And I say, okay, I'm going to create this practice in 120 seconds. I'm just going to try to generate memory. Like, it's the idea. I lay out a table condition. I have my, song, and I go at it. So doing that and trying to generate, conjure, lay out memory in a way, I find it in the gesture, because there's no way I can make this many marks in this time, in this space, in this speed, with a full sense of consciousness. It's just not going to happen, right? Because my brain doesn't work that fast. So if I create a condition based on my own sort of neurological elasticity and capacity in relationship to something that is finite, and then I push my physical self to make that, I think that generates something, and it must be memory. It must be water. It must be air. It must be. So memory as medicine is that. It's in the studio. It's creating a condition, a border to exhaust the possibility of the things that you do not know, but you can produce it, right? Because you don't have to create a condition of a what to have a condition of an if, right? So that's that moment of memory, because I don't have a what. There's no what. There's only an if. So in that, the practice is there, because I just happen to be an artist. That's the road.
Great. Another question.
I have a question for Sara. Sorry, I get quite nervous also. I thought it was really interesting how in your work there's this sort of contrast between what I would call like warmth of the interactions you mentioned of people engaging in the work and then engaging with the people around them, but then also this sort of immediate way that the work is presented that, to me at least, feels kind of austere and cold. I'm just curious if you can sort of speak to maybe some of the choices you make when you create your work.
Yes. So I'm very interested in that juxtaposition. And there was a moment when I was sort of initially recognizing that I was interested in engaging with the possibilities of the built environment, and more specifically, I would say, the architectural environment, that I became acutely aware of the ways that our environment is made, and the materials that our environment is made with, and the industrial processes which produce things like sheetrock and LEDs, and the list is long. And I felt that if I was making, and this I know isn't quite the question, but let me arrive there. So if I was making work by hand, there was a craftiness to it, which meant that I would always and forever be talking about architecture, but wouldn't actually be engaging it. And I wanted the means of production and the means of, I wanted the means of production to be somehow in sync with the system that I was engaging in. And that really directed me towards what might be considered coldness. I think that actually the materials that I'm using are sort of quite quotidian.
Maybe one more question?
I have a question. This was great, everyone. Thank you very much. This is a question for Torkwase. It's about materials and specifically the piece that's shown on the screen right now. But what's it made of? How do you make it? Do you have people in your studio who you work with, or do you do it with your own hands? Is it cast bronze, or is it assembled plywood covered? I'm interested in really exactly what it is and how you do it. I like it a lot.
It's laminated ply. So I started my studio with ply all the time. It's a building material. It has different grades, and it's really easy to think about and create a sort of hard edge geometry from it. And this shape has come, of course, from a series of drawings, but these are cut with a CNC machine, piece by piece. And I've laminated them together and then created a condition where I feel like I understand and recognize it as laminated ply, and then I apply the graphite. So the graphite is applied like a drawing material, and you can see that it's laminated ply. You can see the plywood through it. You can see the ridges, and you can see that sort of industrial moment of repetition and regularity. And then on top of that, I think that this moment of the hand is able to burnish that graphite, to not only lay it down as a material that's used all the time in bridges and buildings and throughways. So in most sort of water facilities, at least in Chicago, they have an entire graphite room where they use this material to lubricate mechanistic conditions. So I found it both a material that I lived and grew up with in Chicago, in my home, and to be able to manipulate them into something that I think talks about, mass and gravity and throughways. And for the top work, and this shape here repeats itself in my work in different ways, in both sort of architectural, sculptural, spatial ways. And sorry, I've put away the clicker here. But the sort of the pedestal, it's steel, right? It's like a pickled raw steel that I set it on top of, that I think, and with those encounters, they're welded. So for me, the material is the material, right? I don't do a lot of covering or masking or sort of burying what the thing is made out of. So if you, touch it, you feel, I think, at least when I touch it, there's something familiar and also disorienting about it at the same time, because you recognize it as something that we live with in our cities and in our countries and in our towns. But I like to be able to go to the corner store and make magic when I get to my place. And then that allows me to do, use machines as an extension of my hand, right? So I can use the shop bot, or can use the laser cutter, or whatever machine that will give me that exact plane, right? And then that plane becomes a line, and that line becomes volume, and that's how I arrive here. But it's about yay high. I don't remember the title of it. Do you remember the title of this work? I don't remember, but I hope that answers your question. It's like if you took a number 2 pencil and just had a fidelity to it for like 2 years.
Looks like we have time for one more question.
This is for Sara. This is following up a little bit with a previous question about your process, about how you actually make the work. I have had the pleasure of experiencing moving some of your really, kind of giant plinths, and they could be a little bit intimidating, but it seems like one of the things that you're doing is slowing it down so much, and also dealing with the weight in a way that it's not intimidating, that it's actually kind of a gentle flow, which is kind of remarkable for something that's so big. But I just really want to know what kind of hardware is in there, because it's just so, there's got to be something in there that's just really kind of amazing that is allowing it to move the way that it's moving.
Yes, 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 so true. And actually, speaking of learning, let's talk about that. I'm really interested in generating tension around what we anticipate and what we experience. And when you're touching an extraordinarily large glass plane or volume or column or beam, and it moves incredibly gracefully and slowly in spite of its mass and its strange orientation, you experience a disruption and a kind of strangeness. And that was achieved by actually a really extraordinary technical component called a hydraulic damper, which is fluidic damper. And one of the things that I've learned, and one of the things that I'm growing currently, is precisely that extraordinary condition that fluid allows for, which is that as something accelerates, it resists. So the more something moves quickly, the more something wants to move sort of faster and faster, the greater the push. And the push is actually not immediate, it's not a hard stop, it's a soft stop. And I've actually sort of rerouted, in some ways, everything I'm doing because of that specific behavior of the material, aka the fluid. And I'm now thinking about this dampening process by building pneumatic systems where everything is linked by air quite specifically, and that air is a really extraordinary medium, because with air things float, air compresses, so unlike hydraulics, it actually has a kind of slowing down, a dampening, and a pushing back, and all of that is sort of at the core of everything I'm doing now. So you're sort of pointing towards a beautiful condition that has tremendous potential and is precisely sort of the road I am on.
That's great. I think we could talk for a long time about what to expect versus what we actually experience, but we can continue the conversation downstairs on the second floor. Thank you so much to both of you.